Our next speaker, who's known to everyone, is Steve McIntosh, CEO, Cayman Finance. Steve is the CEO of Cayman Finance, a position that he's held since September 2022. He also founded the financial services recruitment firm CML in 2004 and later co-founded Nova and Connect, a non-profit focus on employment opportunities for Caymanians. In 2020, Steve launched CareerPoint.com, a tech-enabled startup offering virtual coaching for early and mid-career professionals. And I do also need to say that in the discussions around the forum today, the idea of the TED-style presentations actually came out of discussions with Steve. So Steve, thank you very much for that amazing idea. The topic for his presentation is the rise of the Cayman Islands financial services sector. So please join me in welcoming Steve to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Omari. When I first told Omari what the title of my talk was, he asked if it was a typo, if I'd meant to say rise twice. Can you imagine if I was talking about the fall of the financial sector? But I am going to talk about where we are as an industry and what I consider to be the greatest challenges to our continued success as a financial centre and what we need to do as a country to overcome them. And I want to start with what I believe is known today as a trigger warning. Some of what I'm going to say might offend some people. It's not my intention to offend anyone or to criticize anyone, but as the CEO of Cayman Finance, it would be a dereliction of duty for me not to speak the truth as I see it for fear of causing embarrassment or offense. And if you disagree with anything I say, which of course you're welcome to do, please reach out to me and we can have a discussion about it. You can tell me why. You can check my math, show me where I've gone wrong. The financial industry today employs more than 6,000 residents, including 4,000 Caymanians, and contributes more than 50% of government revenue, $500 million a year. It's often said that the financial industry contributes more than 50% of our GDP, which is true. But I think it understates the true value of the industry to the islands, if anything. And I would think about it slightly differently. The Cayman Islands GDP per capita is around 20 times our nearest Caribbean neighbours. And although Cayman has many unique attributes, what really sets us apart from our neighbours economically is the size of our financial industry relative to our population. If it wasn't for the financial industry, the Cayman Islands economy would almost certainly look a lot like our Caribbean neighbours, only without their natural resources like agriculture and oil, and without their economies of scale. The other key industry sectors here in the Cayman Islands, including tourism, technology, healthcare, construction, are what they are in no small part, thanks to the environment and the infrastructure that has over the many decades been funded to a large extent by the financial industry. It's also thanks to the revenue of the financial industry that we, the citizens, residents, and businesses of the Cayman Islands, pay nothing in direct taxation. It's often said that we pay indirect taxes instead of income and corporation tax. But if you do the math and add up the typical duty that we pay per resident on things like groceries, gas, liquor, and so on, it's literally a few $1,000s a year. It's nowhere near the level it would be in income tax or corporation tax. You've probably noticed a few changes at Cayman Finance in the last couple of years. We have a new team, a new strategy, a new mandate, and a new mission to enhance the success of our members, our clients, and our community. I'm proud to have built a team of outstanding Caymanian professionals in the last 2 years, and I can tell you that they are working incredibly hard every day to make sure this industry continues to thrive, because they know the success of our industry is the best way to enhance the success of our community. So what does the future hold for our industry? The theme of today is 2035. What will the industry look like in 2035? Will it still be contributing half of our government budget, employing thousands of people, powering our economy and the lives we want for our families? Put another way, are we halfway up the mountain, or have we already reached the top? When it comes to challenges, you might expect me to talk about international standards. But thanks to the efforts of our members and public sector partners, every time we've seen new international standards, whether from FATF, the EU, or our mother country, the UK, we've risen to that challenge, introduced the standards, silenced the critics, and carried right on. Here's a timeline you may have seen before showing all the laws and global standards we've implemented since the 1960s. I'll let you study it for 30 seconds. There's going to be a quiz at the end. The good news, as I told an audience from the asset management industry in New York earlier this week, is that for the first time in probably 2 decades, there are no looming threats from international standard setters or the United Kingdom. I've spent the last 2 years speaking to our members, international stakeholders, and our public sector partners, who I spend a great deal of time with, to really understand the prospects for the industry. And from that work, it's become clear to me that the greatest challenges to our industry right now are not external from these guys, but internal. Let's talk about complacency. There's a saying that was inscribed on page 1 of an MBA textbook that stuck with me. To those whom the gods wish to smite, they send 50 years of success. I'm assuming from the reference to the gods that this is from the ancient world, but you can probably see how it applies today, because today we're seeing the problems that our success as an economy have created. That President-elect Omari mentioned in his welcome address this morning, problems like inequality, straining infrastructure, the pace of population growth and development, the high cost of living, and translates to a high cost of doing business for all of you. There's another saying that's often applied to family businesses, rags to rags in 3 generations. It's a Chinese proverb, I didn't make it up. Being an audience of entrepreneurs and business owners, I'm sure you all know how this goes. The first generation toils to build a business. Having built more than one business, I know just how hard it is. You toil day and night for years, and there are many times when you need to move mountains just to survive. The second generation, taught well by the first, diligently continues the work, but already seeing the fruits of previous labor, lacks not so much the motivation, but the imperative to succeed. The third generation, detached from the hard-learned experience and wisdom of the first, never having observed the toil that went into building the business generations ago, and now enjoying the bountiful fruits of the labor, squanders its endowment and runs the business into the ground. Only 3% of family-run businesses survive beyond the third generation, according to the Family Business Institute. 60 years from the creation of our financial industry, we are the third generation. Now, the rise and fall of a family business is by no means inevitable. There are plenty of examples of businesses that continue to thrive for many generations, including some right here in Cayman. But the ones that thrive know the odds are stacked against them. And they do everything they can to avoid the complacency trap. And here in Cayman, when it comes to our financial industry, there are signs that complacency has crept in. Let me expand on that. I don't know if anyone has read Sir Vassal Johnson's memoir, As I See It. If you haven't, you should. I read it many years ago, but I ran into Juliette Defoe, who, as you probably know, is Sir Vassal's daughter, who told me she had worked to have it made into an ebook and re-released on Amazon. So it's available on Kindle, and I recently reread it. It's an incredible story which details the life of a really exceptional Caymanian public servant and tells the story of the founding of our financial industry. It's full of stories of Sir Vassal and his peers and government moving mountains to build the foundations of our financial industry. This is Sir Vassal receiving his well-deserved knighthood from the Queen in front of our Legislative Assembly in 1994. As Sir Vassal presciently observed, our entire industry rests on a bedrock of just a few pivotal government departments, in particular, the General Registry and the Monetary Authority. It's common for people to talk about Cayman Inc., but I prefer to think of it as Cayman OS. I spent a lot of time on this slide. Come up and take a closer look. You can admire the graphic design. Thank you, Mum. Our laws and regulations and government services are just like an operating system. The companies that provide services to clients are like the apps that run on that operating system. But the apps can only function as well as the operating system they run on. And the more apps there are running on the operating system and the more people there are using the apps, the faster the operating system has to run to keep up. Maintaining and debugging the operating system requires diligent focus and investment to make sure it's able to cope with the strain. And in this competitive world, the expectations of our app users, who we know as clients, are rising all the time. They expect our apps to be as seamless as the apps they use on their actual phones every day. And the more they pay for our services, the better and faster they expect them to run. In the 1960s, Sir Vassal Johnson wanted clients to be able to register companies within 24 hours. Think about that, 60 years ago. And his vision was for companies to be able to be registered within 24 hours. Today we have 160,000 companies and partnerships, hundreds of times the volume they had in the 1960s. And the registry has an awful lot more to do than just registering companies. And while we can still register a company in a day for an additional fee, without that express fee, it often takes longer. And there are many things clients need to do other than just registering companies, many of which there is no express option for. I want to be absolutely clear that this is not in any way a criticism of the team at the registry. They work incredibly hard. But they're working with technology that they are the first to admit has not kept pace with the demands put upon it, and a team that hasn't grown at the same pace as the industry it supports. And things are much the same for our regulator, CIMA. In 2020, the Cayman Islands introduced the Private Funds Act, which brought 16,000 more funds into CIMA's regulatory purview. This is the growth in the number of companies and partnerships. Around the same time, between 2015 and 2020, salaries for compliance professionals increased dramatically. The reason was that new requirements on regulated companies had transformed compliance functions among our members from cost centers to profit centers. An experience that the regulator was highly valued by the private sector firms, and it still is. Yet salaries at CIMA were, and still are, constrained by the Public Authorities Act, which binds CIMA to the same pay scale as the Turtle Centre. This made it extremely difficult for them to compete with the private sector for the talent they needed, especially for the Caymanian talent, which was in high demand among financial services firms. And at the same time, Unlike actual government departments, authorities like CIMA have to apply for work permits, just like many of you, which can take months. So this was not just a double whammy, this was a triple whammy, a perfect example of a mountain that had to be moved. But it wasn't a mountain that could be moved by CIMA. It wasn't even a mountain that could be moved by the Financial Services Ministry. The issues were put in place were the rules that had been put in place for good reasons at the time, but which were now causing one of our most important authorities, a pillar of our industry, serious problems. But although there have been some modest changes and improvements, to cut a long story short, the mountain barely budged. CIMA is still bound by the Public Authorities Act, still has to wait in line for work permits, like many of you, when they can't find Caymanians. Sir Vassal Johnson was able to move mountains because he had the support of government. Today, too often, the government is the mountain. I want to reiterate that this is not a criticism of CIMA or the registry. In the 2 years I've had this role, I've developed enormous admiration for the team at CIMA and the registry. Between staffing challenges, ever-increasing volumes and complexity of regulations, they have really been put through the ringer in the last 10 years, and they've handled it all with incredible stoicism. I have never once heard them complain. That's why I'm doing it today on their behalf. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the management staff at the regulator, the registry and the ministry are the unsung heroes of today's financial industry. So, yes, thank you. But the bottom line is this. To retain our position as a leading financial centre in areas like investment funds and to capitalise on the opportunities in emerging sectors like insurance, reinsurance and fintech, we urgently need to invest in upgrading our operating system. We need to invest more in new technology like artificial intelligence and, frankly, allow or even encourage these critical government departments and authorities to hire more people. Instead of asking what the minimum amount of funding we can provide is, we need to start by asking our clients what level of service they expect. Then ask CIMA and the registry what level of resources they need to be able to meet those expectations, and then give them the investment they need. And if we decide not to give them the resources they say they need to meet our customers' expectations, we need to accept that we are going to disappoint our customers. And as you all know well, as business owners and leaders, disappointing customers is not a recipe for continued growth and success. Another example of complacency is our approach to promoting the financial industry, a subject close to our hearts at Cayman Finance. Our government invests $1.4 million a year in promotion of the financial industry. That's their annual contribution to Cayman Finance. And in fact, that's a slight exaggeration. About $1.4 million, that $1.4 million budget gets split up between our 5 strategic priorities, just one of which is promotion. So the actual investment in promotion is less than $500,000 a year. We spend 40 times that, $20 million a year, promoting the tourism industry, which employs fewer Caymanians, contributes a much smaller proportion of government revenue, and puts a much higher strain on our environment and infrastructure. Now, that is not an argument against promoting tourism, by the way, because it is an equally important industry sector. It's an argument for investing more in financial services. For comparison, our counterpart in the Channel Islands, Jersey Finance, receives $8.4 million in funding from their government. At Cayman Finance today, we have a team of 10, up from just 4 only 2 years ago when I took on this role. Jersey Finance has a team of 40. I want to be clear again that I'm not criticising the government of today. In fact, our current funding level has dramatically increased in the last few years, which is one reason our team is now twice the size it was under my predecessor, Jude Scott. And that increase had a lot to do with Jude's hard work over the years. I'm certainly not criticising our former Minister of Financial Services, my good friend Andre Ebanks, because he worked incredibly hard for the industry and achieved a tremendous amount, not just in his role in our removal from the FATF grey list last year, but while the former minister was moving mountains for our industry in Europe, London and DC, it's the ones we've built for ourselves here at home that for some reason seem to be the hardest to move. Industry leaders' warning about complacency is nothing new. Tim Ridley recently sent me a copy of a speech he gave in 2009 in which he warned against what he saw as complacency at that time. And in case you think we're crying wolf, there is more than one example from around the region of former international financial centres. Those who fail to learn the lessons of the past are doomed to repeat them. And just as they were in former Caribbean financial centres, the political decisions that got us here have been a legitimate democratic response to the sentiment among the public. And I'm not speaking anecdotally. We have the data to prove it. 2 years ago, shortly after I took on this role, we began conducting an annual telephone survey with the help of Tower Marketing to find out just how the public perceives the financial industry. Here's the question we ask. On a scale of 1 to 10, how positively does the financial industry contribute to the island's overall well-being? What this survey revealed was widespread apathy towards the industry. The first survey in January 2023 found that 58% of Caymanians had a negative or neutral view of the industry. Among Caymanians in North Side and East End, only 20% of Caymanians had a positive view of the financial industry. And that's all the more striking considering that when this survey was conducted at the start of January 2023, we'd just come through 2 years of economic blight, courtesy of the COVID-19 pandemic. But why should the public care? Most Caymanians don't work in financial services. And they don't decide how they feel about the industry by looking up the ESO reports to find out how much we contribute to GDP. But remember, the financial industry generates 50 cents on every dollar of government spending. That's why my message today is aimed as much at convincing the Caymanian public and the broader business community to care about the financial services industry as it is aimed at the government. Supporting the industry should be a matter of national priority, but it won't be a priority for the government unless it's a priority for the people. Now let's move on to talk about talent, one of the big themes of today. Everyone knows talent is a subject near and dear to my heart. But it's also the number one challenge to the growth and success of our industry. If I were to ask you how much our industry has grown in the last 15 years in percentage terms, what would you say? Throw out a number. 10%. Love it. Let's see. So back in 2019, the Bankers Association hired a consulting firm called Oxford Economics to carry out a detailed economic impact study. You can find it online. It showed that at the time, the industry contributed $1.1 billion to the island's GDP, $200 million in government revenue, employed 5,700 people, roughly 2/3 of whom were Caymanian. In 2022, the most recent year we have figures for, the industry generated $353 million in government revenue. We estimate that number will be closer to 400 million this year. That's almost a 100% increase in the 15 years since the Oxford Economic Study. And that's just company fees, by the way. It doesn't include work permits and duty, which account for at least another 150 million annually. In the same 15-year period, the industry contributed to our GDP industry's contribution to our GDP more than doubled, from 1.1 billion in 2009 to 2.3 billion in 2023. But here are a couple of striking facts that most people don't realize. First, although our total GDP has increased dramatically, from 2 billion in 2009 to 6 billion in 2023, our GDP per capita has fallen precipitously. From 68,000 CI per capita in 2017 to only 59,000 in 2023, according to the ESO. That's a reduction of 17% in just 6 years. And that one fact alone should be ringing loud alarm bells for all of us, because it means the growth path the country has chosen is making us less well off. And while the industry's contribution to government revenue and GDP have both doubled since 2009, the number of jobs in the sector has barely grown. We estimate that we currently have around 6,200 jobs, so up by less than 10% on 15 years ago. So why hasn't the industry grown? You're all experts in business, so you might think it's a result of improved efficiency from new technology, and that is part of the story. A friend of mine at a well-known accounting firm told me that they're doing 10 times as many audits with twice as many staff. So they're now 5 times more efficient. So that is certainly part of the story. But if you compare the local offices of international financial services firms to the overseas offices in, say, Dublin or Toronto, some of those overseas offices have grown tenfold, while the Cayman offices have stayed the same or downsized. We have the same technology as Toronto, so technology can't be the issue. So if it's not technology, what's the reason? A generous way to put it would be that we have not encouraged the industry to grow. That might seem very strange considering the increase in business volume, that steep line for the increase in registered companies and partnerships, the increase in population, which has been considerable in the last 20 years, and how lucrative the industry is for the Cayman Islands Treasury. But you see, financial services is a knowledge business, a business that depends on people. But unlike most other sectors in Cayman, the people actually doing the work can be based anywhere in the world. It used to be, around the time I arrived in the Cayman Islands in 2001, there were a number of smaller financial services companies and a number of international companies headquartered here. Many of them boomed in the 2000s. But with that boom came a boom in work permits, which perhaps inevitably created a backlash. The government and the Caymanian people became unsettled with the scale of immigration and by what they saw as good jobs going to expatriates instead of Caymanians. The government began making it much harder to get work permits and all but outlawed temporary contractors that the industry relied on to fill in the gaps while they waited for work permits. At the same time, the financial crisis of 2008 had begun to bite. The economy had tipped into recession. The government faced a growing annual deficit. Many of you will recall those days with no fondness. The cost of work permits tripled. And the increased volume of work permit applications, not from the financial industry, but from all sectors of the economy, slowed the entire process down. Today, a work permit for a senior accountant costs 15,000 Cayman Islands dollars and typically takes up to 3 months to process, even when there are no Caymanian applicants, which for accounting jobs, there often are not, because there are 15 times as many jobs as there are Caymanian accountants. Add to this that it takes several months to advertise and select a candidate, and several more months if they need to relocate. All told, it could take 9 months from the time a company decides to hire someone to the time someone starts in the job. Now, it's not the cost and delay in obtaining work permits. It's not that those costs and delays are not a problem for other companies in other sectors. It's that most companies in other sectors don't have a choice. They need people here in Cayman, and so they have to pay whatever the government decides and wait as long as it takes. Financial services companies, on the other hand, do have a choice. In Toronto or Dublin, a company can hire someone in a matter of weeks. And if you can't wait, you can hire a temporary contractor to fill in right away. And either way, no $15,000 work permit fee. There's also a long-standing convention that financial services companies here in Cayman are not permitted to hire non-Caymanian graduates. When I worked at KPMG in Glasgow, 40% of the entire firm were graduate trainees. So a normal professional firm looks like this. Here in Cayman, because there simply aren't enough Caymanian graduates to fill the entry-level roles, we don't have exact data, but instead of 40%, it would probably be about 3%, so it looks more like this. Instead of a pyramid, it's some kind of hat. It's like a pilgrim, I think it is. That makes it extremely expensive for financial services firms to do business here compared to competing financial centres. And those are just the self-inflicted factors. Other global trends in the last 10 years made it even less attractive for employers to create financial services jobs here in Cayman. First, the impact of technology that made it much easier for employees to work remotely. You might think that was a consequence of the pandemic, but Cayman-based companies had remote workers 20 years ago, long before the days of Zoom. COVID merely accelerated a trend that was well underway. Remote workers don't need a $15,000 work permit, and needless to say, contribute a great deal less to our economy than workers based here. These days, if a company wants to hire someone and can't find someone locally and can't wait for a work permit, they can simply find someone somewhere else, tell them to stay where they are, and work from home. They can send them a laptop, can start tomorrow. No work permit required. Another factor was the increased cost of living. In 2003, my wife and I were able to rent a 2-bedroom beachfront apartment for $2,000. Those were the days. Then we had kids. Today, that same place would cost $4,000. Yet another factor, industry consolidation. Many smaller financial services companies founded here in Cayman have been acquired by private equity firms. Private equity firms, which are not based here in Cayman, have no compunction whatsoever about offshoring jobs. Indeed, ruthless cost saving is how private equity works. And it's this widespread offshoring of jobs which I believe has reached the level of a crisis, in which I'm here to sound the alarm about today. You might say we can't or shouldn't try to compete with low-cost jurisdictions. I would agree. The jobs I'm talking about haven't gone to Hyderabad or Manila. They've gone to places like Hong Kong, Dublin, or Toronto. None of these are low-cost centres. Dublin has the highest cost of living in the entire EU. And while as an industry, we've invested heavily in the development of local talent, and we can do more, we have to be realistic about the pace of that improvement. We've talked a lot today about workforce planning and talent development. But even if we fixed our education system tomorrow and implemented the best workforce planning you've ever seen, it could take 5 or 10 years to translate to significant improvement in supply. And even then, it probably still wouldn't be enough. More than 90% of the jobs in financial services are graduate jobs. And if you're not a graduate, financial services is probably not the best career option for you, because your prospects for advancement are limited. According to the most recent labour force survey from the ESO, the unemployment rate among Caymanian graduates is only 2%. And the fact the headcount of the industry has barely increased hides massive disparities between sectors. So some of our firms, and you might be thinking this, haven't lots of our firms grown significantly in the last 15 years, especially the accounting and law firms? Yes, they have. Our estimates show that 60% of the financial services employees today work for a firm that has grown dramatically. And among Caymanian graduates, that number is probably much higher because the vast majority of Caymanian graduates go to work for a big accounting or law firm. So that gives people the impression that the entire industry has grown. But at the same time, two industries that have contracted equally dramatically are fund administration and banking. When I founded CML in 2004, 70% of our placements were in fund administration. By 2021, when I left, that percentage was zero. Nothing. Over the last 15 years, the Cayman Islands Fund Administration Association shrank from more than 40 members to less than 25. Again, that should be sounding alarm bells. And the industry, to be fair, has been raising the alarm since 2008, when the fund administrators started leaving or moved their offices to Canada. During the same time, the footprint of some Class A retail banks has halved in size. Contrast this with the population of the islands in general, which has increased by more than 60%, and the growth of the tourism sector, in which the headcount has grown by more than 50%, according to the ESO. You can't work remotely in tourism. Hotels can't offshore jobs. There's a hotel going up near Georgetown, the Grand Hyatt. I'm not speaking out of school. You can't miss it. It'll probably employ close to 500 people, I'm guessing. The vast majority of those employees will probably be work permit holders. 10% of them might be Caymanian, most of whom will probably come from other hotels. If you were to go to the government and say you wanted to open a new financial services company and needed 450 work permits for accountants, I'm not really sure, but I think you would have a hard time. Seems like a double standard. Work permit fees for financial services workers are 5 times the level of permit fees for workers in tourism. Workers in financial services earn more and spend more in our economy. Workers in financial services, on average, generate $400,000 of GDP, 10 times the contribution of a tourism worker. That's why our GDP per capita has shrunk, because we have so many fewer of those financial services workers per capita. We've allowed in tens of thousands of people in other industry sectors, but oddly, not in financial services. The industry on which our entire economy and arguably our entire way of life depends. Now, this isn't an argument against development in tourism. Again, it's a false choice. We don't need to stop investing in tourism. We need to start investing in financial services. Now, you might be thinking the solution is to increase the number of Caymanian graduates. That is part of the solution, no question. At Cayman Finance, we have a full-time member of staff devoted to community engagement and developing local talent, Danielle Hennings, she's here today somewhere, who is doing sterling work day in, day out, by the way. But even if we were to double the number of Caymanian graduates, and I don't know how we would do that, by the way, because right now 33% of Caymanians have college or university degrees compared to 40% in the UK and 38% in the USA, so we're not that far behind. But even if we did somehow double the number of graduates and then somehow convince them all to work in financial services, we'd still have nowhere near enough people for all the jobs that we could create if we chose to. And Caymanian graduates have a lot of options. My daughter, who is Caymanian, born and raised here in Cayman, just turned 17, which I did have to wait in line for just a short time at the DVLD to make the appointment for her written test. She got good grades. She could probably find a job in financial services. Her old man knows a few people in the industry. But she doesn't want to. She wants to be an architect. And why not? She sees what happens to you if you become an accountant. In the UK, only 7% of graduates go into financial services jobs. And there are 200 applicants for every single job. You might be thinking, why don't we just pass a law that prevents companies offshoring jobs? That has been asked. It was asked when I gave a similar speech at UCCI during the Q&A. Someone asked that. Well, we should just put a stop to this, right? Well, first, if we did that, we'd have to allow companies to create thousands of new jobs here in Cayman, which, because of the math I just went through, would need to be filled with work permit holders. So the outcome would be the same if we simply allowed it rather than required it. Second, you can't outlaw it. Most remote workers aren't technically employees of Cayman firms. They're independent contractors or employees of affiliates in other countries. They're just people who work in other offices of the same company. To outlaw the offshoring of jobs, you need to make it illegal for Cayman firms to buy services from overseas firms. Just impossible, completely impossible. And you might be wondering why you haven't heard about this so-called offshoring crisis before. If it's such a crisis, why hasn't the financial industry been demanding action? Two reasons, one of which has come up a few times today. The first reason is that it's very hard to see in the data. The ESO doesn't report employment data in a way that corresponds to what we understand as the financial industry. It's kind of split across a few different categories in the standard international classification. But the main reason, and this is a key point, is that the private sector has no problem in the current situation. The private sector is happily creating jobs they need in other places. It may not be a problem for those companies, but it's a big problem for our economy. Not only are we holding our economy back and actively reducing our GDP per capita, we're undermining our most important industry sector. Because as companies downsize here in Cayman, the mind and management of those companies is steadily moving away. And so the question I would put to you, the business community and the leaders of the country, is this. Do we want our financial industry to grow and thrive and to continue to support the country or not? If the answer is no, then we have to accept that the industry will continue to flatline and that in 10 years' time, there is almost no chance the industry will still be contributing 50% of our government revenue. If the answer is yes, then we need to take this issue seriously and start moving some of these mountains. The solutions are clear, and they've already been talked about today. We need to do a much better job of workforce planning. We need to do everything we possibly can to support Caymanians who want to work in the sector so that every Caymanian who is willing and able to work in this industry has the opportunity to do so. That is and will remain our number one priority as an organization. But we also need to be realistic about the outcome of those efforts in the short and medium term, and allow financial services companies to hire the people they need from overseas when Caymanians are not available. Just as we do for our hotels, our restaurants, and every other sector of our economy. The ESO predicts that our population will increase to 93,000 in the next 3 years. That's an additional 8,000 people. Every year, the Caymanian-born population increases by about 500. which means that the ESO predicts that we will have 6,500 more work permit holders in 3 years' time than we have today. So it's not that we're not allowing the population to grow, and it's not that we're not granting work permits. The question is, do you want any of those new work permit holders to be in financial services, or do we want them all to be in other less productive sectors? Look, I know immigration is going to be a hot topic in the election, but the next government simply has to find a way to protect Caymanians and develop local talent without incentivizing companies to create jobs and hire remote workers in other countries. It can be done. Frankly, it has to be done, because the growth of our financial industry doesn't get back on track and keep up with the growth of our population. The Cayman Islands will be a very different place for our children. It will have all of today's problems without the government revenue, job opportunities, and economic activity we've all become used to. Are we halfway up the mountain? Or have we already reached the top? That is for the Caymanian people and the leaders of tomorrow to decide. What will the future hold? I don't know. But as Abraham Lincoln said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. Thank you very much.